Hello and welcome to the Pallychat Grief Tending series. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians on whose unceded lands these interviews are recorded, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, to acknowledge the continued connection to land, waters and culture, and to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. In this episode of the Grief Tending series, I'm joined by Zenith Virago, who's a Deathwalker, a Celebrant and community educator. Zenith is the executive officer and founding member of the New South Wales charity the Natural Deathcare Centre, co-author of the book The Intimacy of Death and Dying, and she's also the subject of the international independent documentary Zen and the Art of Dying. Zenith has been a leading pioneer of dying well, family-led body care, meaningful and appropriate ceremony, and informing and educating communities to reclaim and be empowered before, during, and after death for many years. Zenith's work encourages people to take their dying, death, and after-death care and ceremony back into their own hands and hearts, even in cases of sudden death and trauma. With a legal and community background, she is seen as a community resource, assisting people to know and reclaim their legal rights and co-create their own social rites of passage. She's been working towards more holistic cultural change in approaches to better and continual end-of-life and after-death care for well over 25 years. Zenith now works, speaks and teaches internationally as well as nationally, and her work may be best summed up as assisting people to die well, and for those left behind to have a healthier bereavement as they move into their healing with few or no regrets. And in her work as a death worker and celebrant and co-founder of the Natural Deathcare Centre, Zenith's been a long-time advocate of empowered community-centric approaches to death care. And that's certainly something that's been quite foundational for us at Hummingbird House when we were starting out, and really shaped how we try and ensure that not only death and after-death care, but also grief care is approached from a community-centric perspective. So it's a real honor to be able to speak with Zenith today. Some of the themes that we discuss in this episode include the range of reactions that can be present in loss through death, which can include but aren't limited to grief. We also talk about the importance of ceremony in tending to grief following the death of a family or community member. And then we expand from the individual to talk around what collective grief gatherings and rituals can offer, and how these can facilitate a type of witnessing and collective grief tending that's much needed in communities today. And then finally, we talk about how memorials, which take place many years after a death or a grief event, can still be very, very important and helpful for people. Essentially, that it's never too late to tend to grief, especially if people are carrying ongoing regrets or things they maybe wished had been different, that it's still possible many years later to tend to that grief. So, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Grief Tending. I hope you find it helpful and useful. Hi, Zenith. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
As I let people know in the introduction, today's interview is not so much a 101. So if people aren't familiar with your work, we've kind of placed links to the Natural Deathcare Centre and to, documentary and various other interviews with you that talk more, I suppose, around the history and development of that work. Today, we were keen to talk particularly about the relationship to grief and tending to grief in the areas of kind of work and experience that you have had. And I think, I was wondering about asking you, although you're known nationally, internationally as a teacher and educator in this space, the entrance to this kind of world or this area for you didn't come as a health professional. It came as, on a personal experience with a death of a close friend. Could you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I don't have any medical experience. I was working in law, and so I understood that everybody was just someone doing their job. And so when my friend died, we decided we could do it ourselves. And I just approached a local funeral director who, against all the odds, it gave me the information that we needed and was incredibly supportive. And in fact, for my entire career with death, I have followed his example to me, which was generosity. So when someone asks me for something, I give. If it's within my power to give it, I give it. If that's information or assistance or guidance, and that has been a great way of going through the deathcare world.
Yeah. Yeah, and within that, kind of within that career of your time within that deathcare space, you have obviously had a lot of experience, and you were reflecting on that in the TED talk you gave recently, and I think that was maybe uploaded during COVID, and in that talk, it seemed to me it was sort of bookended by two very different ways of speaking about death. You started by talking about the way that death is often framed in the kind of Western medical system as a failure, and at the end of the talk, you speak around death as having been one of your greatest teachers. So I was wanting to ask you if you could
Mm.
talk about how you think people's, individuals or families' experiences of grief can be impacted by the different ways in which they might approach death.
I think what's been very helpful for me, and what my 30 years of work in that field has shown me, is that grief is not always the default position for loss. So, as most people listening will know or watching will know, is that there are different sorts of death, and the immediate breakdown is sudden or expected. But from those two stream a range of different options and occurrences, and people's response to that will be very different. And so for me, it became quite clear there was an equation for each death, which creates a response. So just as we proceed, it's probably easier to give that equation. So it's sort of who the person is, how they live, and how they die, plus who you are, your relationship to that person, and your experience with death so far will give you a response. And that response will be different every time because the two parts of that equation are different every time. So sometimes people think, oh, I'm getting good at this. And then another death will occur and slam. They're on their knees, they're heartbroken, and it can throw them. So I think it's very helpful to see that each death will create an individual response, and that response is uniquely yours.
Yeah, and I think that. Go ahead.
And sorry, and so from there, some deaths will absolutely warrant a grief or a deep grief or a deep distress, a despair. But some other deaths will create a response which is that it's a relief that that person has died. It's a release from their suffering, from the suffering as family or friends who are accompanying that, whatever family it looks like. It doesn't necessarily have to be by blood. And so some people will actually go to a joy. They'll feel that they and that person are liberated, or one or the other. But in the midpoint between, say, joy and grief are a range of things. But the midpoint I experience is sadness. That sadness is always present in some form. But so if we put everybody in that grief funnel and assume, which media have been very good at because it's an easy out for them and it also makes for drama, then, but if we see that people can sit with sadness, and we all know what sadness feels like. Some of us, are shocked by the intensity of our emotions. And so it's a sort of swinging thing in a response. So that's when I sit at the kitchen table with families, when I sit at the bedside of someone who's dying, I don't assume either point, the end point. I sit and see them from that midpoint, and then we can go anywhere from there. Because sometimes people have said to me, oh, Zen, you know, I'm really happy that that person has died. It's a relief for them. It's a relief for us. Whereas if I come in with my big grief blanket of, oh, I'm so sorry that your mom's died. That must be so terrible for you. They're not going to tell me that actually it's okay. So it's really good to be neutral and to meet people where they are at.
Yeah, that makes me think that often I hear from grieving parents actually that people so often come with projections of various natures. You know, you just named one of them there, but anytime you start a sentence with "you must be feeling dot dot dot," it's probably worth
Mm,
dropping that and maybe framing it in terms of a question or an inquiry, or saying nothing. You know, so yeah,
mm,
I think that's really
mm.
important for people to reflect, is sort of to check what's happening for themselves. It sounds like you're saying before they bring those assumptions to what people will be.
Yeah, and the biggest thing that you're working with children is, it's a general assumption by most people that losing your child is the worst possible experience. And so people really come because it may be their worst nightmare. And but both you and many of the workers at your center and anybody who's listening, watching, who is a care worker with children will also know that some parents and children are able to accept that experience and live it fully. And so, they know that that death of the child will occur or the person, but they don't want to miss the every moment that they have by being caught in some sort of dread or fear. It's sort of like, okay, this is what's happening. We don't want it to be happening, but let's do this the very best we can and let's really feel it. Let's be in it together. And,
Mm.
people like us who accompany those people are just so full of incredible respect for people's courage and capacity. And that is why death has been one of my greatest teachers, to see just with good guidance and respect and whatever assistance you have to offer, that people are very courageous and very capable.
In addition to your work walking alongside people as they prepare for their death and supporting their families, you've also been a celebrant for many years, and you teach funeral celebrancy as well. Um, in those teachings, I've often heard you speak about the importance of ceremony in tending to grief or sadness or the various experiences people might be having after someone dies.
Mm.
So I was wondering, could you talk to us around the importance of ceremony at those times?
Yeah, I think the ceremony that people create for their person is very important. And one of the biggest changes we've seen is the reclaiming of that ceremony away from the church so that people can create something that is meaningful and appropriate for them. If you want the church, if you want a ceremony of your faith, wonderful. If that faith supports you, great. But a lot of people now aren't following a faith for whatever reason. And so what I see over and over again is that people want to create a ceremony that is, as I say, meaningful and appropriate, but also deeply respectful of life, of death, of all people's beliefs. And so, but what I can see from my perspective now is that the ceremony is the sort of gateway transition from having the physical body there, even though it's died, and to letting it go into the cremator or the grave. So it is the last possible option to be in connection with the physical body. And when the death occurs, whether that's sudden or expected, there is still a shock. And so often people are responding to that in whatever their response is to that particular death. And so then when they meet with the celebrant to create that ceremony, the celebrant is like a first responder. which means there's someone who is offering you something that isn't medical, that isn't legal, that is an optional activity for you. And it gives you the potential to create something that will assist you into living without that person physically in your lives. And it doesn't have to look like anything. It can look like whatever is the right thing for people organizing it and the person who's died. But what I see over and over again is the more people have the ability to participate in the creation and the delivery of that ceremony with a celebrant who's not dictating how it should be, but is working with those people, then whatever occurs during that ceremony, because it's incredible to watch people crying, being heartbroken at music, that when they're really deeply into their love and loss of that person. But by the end of the ceremony, they've had stories and sharings where people are laughing and crying. And sometimes by the time they wave that person off in the hearse to leave or put them into the grave, they turn away and they're laughing and smiling together as family. And it's an extraordinary transition to assist in creating and to watch people be able to move that fast in an hour and a half. And so ceremony is so powerful at a pivotal time, but it can be powerful at any time. So even as a memorial a year later, even 10, 20 years. I've just done a ceremony for my son, whose father killed himself when he was 13. And now he is, in his 30s, and we did a 20-year ceremony for that. He's now married with children, and it was extraordinary to see him express his feelings about that now as a grown man, and with a life of his own. And it's never too late. And I've said this often, but I'll say it again: is that for me, I think you can do sort of 12 months therapy in one ceremony. So if you work out the purposes that you want that ceremony to serve, and then make it serve those purposes, you can really be in control, because death is often, a lot of responses are because people are out of control of that situation. They don't want that person to die, or they don't want them to have died. And so suddenly here you have a chance is to, to manage your own response to that and create something externally and what it looks like and what the ingredients are, but also what people do with their emotional and love and all those responses that happen on the inside, so that by the time that ceremony finishes, they are, feeling that they have done what was right for them, and then they can walk on into their lives without that person and feel that they absolutely honored that person and themselves.
You were speaking just before about, people getting clear around what purpose they want a ceremony to serve, and then designing it around that. And so to link back to something you were saying earlier about very often that, more and more these days people might be looking at holding a ceremony without the framework of religion or spiritual tradition, which often also takes care of or provides what the purpose is. So I just wonder, could you share a couple of thoughts for people who might be facing this or will face this in the future? If they're not within a tradition like that, what are some of the purposes that you see people choose to have ceremonies at death serve?
Well, one of the first things that most people say is we don't want it to be morbid. So I generally say, I don't work with morbid. I don't actually know what morbid is. So, but what I do say is that you have to touch that sadness. You have to acknowledge the death fully. You can't just go in a straight line. So what I try and do is take people, I pick them up, carry them along for a little bit so that we feel that we're safe to move together, and then take them into that sadness, into their deepest point. Because, as I say, sadness is always present for whatever reason. Even if it's not for you, it might be for the grandchildren, or it might be for the childhood that you never had, or the loving connection that you never had with that person, whatever. And so to feel that fully, because once you've felt it, then you can go on to be in the joy, in the celebration of that person's life. And it doesn't matter what, and really it's not about what the person achieved, it's about the quality of who they were. And there's a great Buddhist saying that, it's who you love. Oh, actually, I can't remember it now. It's so long since I've had to quote it. But what I do see is that it's the quality of the person and how much they're loved. Because if no one loves you, no one comes to that ceremony, so you don't need to have one. So it's that sort of simple. And then it's an opportunity to really honor that person, celebrate your relationship to that person. And also sometimes people come out with the most incredible things that they've learned about living with that loss or expecting it. And dementia, a lot of people now are caring for people with dementia. So it's like they've died 10 years ago and then they finally physically die. And, there's a whole chaos in those feelings because in a way you've already let go of that person. But now 10 years later, you're letting go of their body and you have to sort of, be able to and address all of that in that ceremony. So if people think about what purposes they want it to serve, it's usually pretty clear to them because it's their life and it's their loss. And so I very rarely, I can't even remember when I've had to say, well, do you want it to serve this purpose? If you ask them clearly, they generally know what they want to address and how they want to feel at the end of it.
You were speaking before about the ways in which people might hold ceremony for deaths that are not immediate at this time, but may have happened, in previous times. So I wanted to talk about that a bit because my experience is, sometimes if we are supporting families here at the hospice, or I can hear other colleagues talk about how extended relatives or families might come in, and the death of someone who they know triggers in them a realization that, oh, actually when this person in my life died 10 or 15 years ago, either I didn't have a chance, or I
Mm.
didn't know about, say, more participatory approaches, or I didn't know being at home was an option. Or it might be that even they chose not to have a funeral at that time, or things like this. So I suppose I'm asking about this kind of retrospective or historic kind of turning around and having what might be known more as memorials, and just whether you could share, this is something that I think you work with, and people might not realize that that's an option,
Mm.
perhaps.
Yeah, so I would just simply say it's never too late, and you cannot underestimate the power of ceremony. Even if it's something very simple, like sitting alone with a photograph, lighting a candle, and just being with those feelings that you feel, or being in connection to the divine, if you have a connection to that, being part of the mystery, being connected to that person with your heart and your thoughts. And some people have a channel. I don't, so I can't speak to that, but I certainly see it with a lot of people. So I think you just have to, whatever it takes for you to feel complete. And we're not talking about completion, because it's an ongoing experience and it's changing because you're learning from that experience all the time. And one of the great things I see is that when people look back to a death, that's happened 5, 10, 20 years ago, they'll often be able to, in a period of time passes, they'll be able to see what they learned from that death, or how that death affected the way they lived. And I can say that from my own experience, when I was 14, my best friend died because of neglect from the hospital. And I know that I've lived my whole life with that awareness that I could die tomorrow, not through my own physical body failing, but because of an accident, because of not getting the right treatment. And that has really enriched my life about seizing every moment that I'm alive, and I'm living in that experience. And now I'm in my 60s, and so that's 40 years of living like that, and it certainly hasn't done me any harm, as they say. But I think that if if you've got a group of people that are affected by it, to just create whatever feels right for you. But some people don't, or even now, unable or choosing not to share their emotions in public. So they don't want to be demonstratively upset at a public ceremony. They might want to do that in the privacy of their own home. So rather than just throwing yourself on the bed or having a good cry at a movie, pull that back into something that is a little bit more meaningful and see where that goes, and just open to that possibility, because it's a rite of passage, and it always takes us from one place to another. And we really want to benefit from that experience rather than it being detrimental to our well-being or to our own lives. And death is a natural part of our life, and we've got this anti-aging, anti-death sort of campaign about ignoring it. But we know that for many years, people like me, people like you, everyone has been part of bringing death back into our everyday awareness, and doing that in a way so it's not so shocking, that it becomes something that we can live with and we can learn from, and we can be better people for that experience in who we are on the inside and what we contribute to the world.
Yeah, I think this is an important point, because I think increasingly, particularly within the health system, if people are looking from within the health system for grief support, typically that care is spoken about in clinical and medicalized terms, but in the same way that
Yeah.
death is everyone's business, as the phrase goes. Kind of death is a whole of community concern. So is grief in that way, whether people choose to be public or private with it. And so I think one of the challenges can be that often people then only maybe perceive grief supports as being the medical or the clinical, kind of option, which means then that they're individualized. So, for many years you've been creating and cultivating community spaces for grief to be expressed and witnessed collectively. You host the Day of the Dead event down in the Northern Rivers. So could you speak about why those events are important, and what community members experience when grief is offered a collective space?
Mm. So I think that, as we all know, when we attend a funeral, it's everyone's focused on one person, and we're all connected by that one person, or maybe by their parents, or someone else that we're coming to support. But generally, it's because that one person has died. So for the last, I think, 17 years here, I've put on the Day of the Dead once a year, which is a ceremony in the park. People come, they bring a blanket, we create a shrine around a tree, and then they lay down, and then I offer a ceremony which is complemented by a local choir singing several times during that. It's very simple. But what I see there is that because everyone's there for their own people, no one's concerned about what you're doing. And somewhere in that, there's a liberation for people, because they don't feel they have to comfort you because they're busy. They don't know who you are and what your connection is. They don't even know what your person is. They're just loving that you're there also in that moment. And so people are on their own little blankets, just really intensely having their experience, because it's some years ago, or because it's this year, because they didn't get to the ceremony, they weren't invited, their relationship might have been secret. But especially in the case of parents whose children have died, then I do it just before Christmas in November. And the reason I do it then is because I feel if those parents get to be fully with the loss of their dead child, it frees them up for the living family in a season of celebration and, fully about life and love. And I see that most particularly with people whose parents have died and people whose children have died. And there's something in the way that the parents honor that and honor themselves and their child that is unique to them. And often people will come with someone and say, "This is my friend, their child just died during the year." And I say, "Can I give you to the other parents of dead children? Because it's not my personal experience. I can be with that in a very easy and comfortable and beneficial way. But there's something that happens between those parents, a language that is unspoken, that resonates between them. They just have to take a look at each other and they melt into each other and they are comforted by the sameness of their experience. And then the ceremony occurs and people just always feel better. They And we have that incredible capacity to go deep, to feel, that we're ripped apart, and then, to be able to have a piece of cake and a cup of tea together. I mean, we see it all the time. Human beings are incredible in their capacity and also their capacity to embrace others. And so I find the Day of the Dead or any sort of community ceremony where it's not for specifically one person, a great opportunity, even, 1, 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, and there are parents who come every year and there are parents who come when their children are would have been at a turning point like 18 or 25 or 30 or something like that, because they just want to honor that. And no one else has that understanding other than them and other parents who have that experience.
Zenith, you've been teaching and accompanying families and serving the community in deathcare for several decades now. And when you started, this was much more of a pioneering work that there were a couple of places, at least in the Western world, where this was being kind of reanimated. There's obviously many traditional cultures around the world. This type of care has continued unbroken for centuries. But in the context of kind of Australia and northern New South Wales specifically, you were really pioneering this work, and you were speaking about that you've recently stopped offering in-person trainings, but have developed this online training for the Deathwalker series and also for your celebrancy trainings. So I just wanted to invite you to share with people a bit more information about that if they're interested. And we were speaking before we recorded today, and you were talking about the importance of self-care in how those episodes came together, but not only for participants, but also for yourself.
Yeah, so I've spent 30 years doing that work, and it's been, as I say, an incredible learning and very beneficial to the quality of my life. And I don't know who I would be if I hadn't said yes when death offered itself to me and stepped up to that mark. And really, it's had a life of its own. It wasn't unlike now where people feel they have a calling or they set an intention to do that work. That's not what happened for me. And I, about 18 months ago, had a really clear feeling that I would be ready to finish. And so I put a lot of effort into recording while I still had the juice, while I was still deeply involved in that work, and put it online. And then last year I stopped because I want to take time out. And whether or not I go back to that work, I mean, I'm always available to people. And we're in it every day in our community and with friends and family. But part of that teaching is about deep knowing about self-care, about not thinking you're always the person for that family, and to see that we're in it together. And I absolutely see that the wave I came in on, where there were a few people globally on that wave, behind us is a third wave full of young people. And I have to put you in that box, Ellen, and a lot of other people that I've met over many years. And that wave is that wave of change, that wave of deep respect, that wave of excitement is unstoppable for people. And what we created on the North Coast here in Australia was, a death style that really complemented our lifestyle. We reclaimed it back from the, institutions, from medicine itself, and it it's only been a good thing. And so I am now taking that time out, but the whatever people are getting from this interview, the depth of that, the respect that I'm bringing to everything is absolutely embodied in that online training. But really, it's not a tick list training. It's about opening that up and for people to start to create their own capacity for that work, because it either wakes something up or it reminds you that you already have that inherent capacity. You just need to hone it a bit or start doing that work, because we're doing it every day when we bump into someone in the supermarket. You know. So the trainings are there for anyone who's interested, both on walking and accompanying people who are dying, who are working with the dying, caring for the dying, or for celebrancy.
Yeah, and I want to thank you so much for developing those resources. I think, in addition to your work in your local community, this is really helping to people to have access to that. And I think obviously the COVID times really connected people across geographic areas in a larger way. And I know our team here has really benefited from those trainings as well, and certainly encourage people to explore them, because your voice in encouraging the rest of community to step back in to death care and to grief care as well is really important. So, Zenith, I want to thank you again for your time today. All the best. Thank you.